All right, thanks everyone for attending my presentation today. I really love presenting at B-Sides conferences because of the audience, the mix of individuals that come to these conferences. It's an audience that I like talking to because it's very different than actually my background. So my name's Crane Hassold. I'm the director of threat intelligence at Abnormal Security, where I oversee a team of researchers that look at enterprise-focused phishing threats. But my background isn't actually technical. Prior to moving over to the private sector in 2015, I was with the FBI for 11 years. And most of that time I spent in the behavioral analysis units in Quantico, Virginia, where I did some violent crime profiling. And then with a couple other folks, actually created the FBI's Cyber Behavioral Analysis Center, which takes those concepts that have been used for decades in the violent crime profiling space and applied them to cyber threats and cyber threat actors to look at them in a completely different perspective. And so my background is actually not technical. It's more human behavior, psychology, and intelligence based. And what I'll be talking about today is, how we can, as an industry, take the technical components of what we do on a day-to-day basis and how we report things and make it more effective for a wider audience. And, as we go through this presentation, we'll talk about intelligence, but then we'll also talk about some applications of intelligence that we can use to look at, different types of attacks, not just malware attacks, but also more pure social engineering attacks like business email compromise, and look at some interesting sort of intelligence collection methods around that. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. And so we'll kick off the presentation with just looking at how we as an industry tackle the problem of intelligence and what we report and how we report it, and how it is really a challenge from a communication perspective and how we want to get information out to the right people. As an industry, we do a lot of reporting on malware. I was just a couple days ago getting this slide together, just looking at some of the various technical analyses that have been written over the past couple of years. This is just a handful of them, but we do a lot of reporting on malware, on other technical artifacts that we find in attacks that we see, and it's all well and good, but what does that really contain? What do these reports usually contain? Many times they include things like just binary execution analysis, source code of the malware, looking through a walkthrough of functions, processes, strings, an overview of the debugging and disassembly process that went into analyzing the malware, reverse engineering the malware, a detailed description of various technical exploits that were being used, a look at the shell code, going into detail about some of the files and keys that were created, looking at network behavior and defensive mechanisms of the malware. And, for a very specific audience, this may be relevant and may be useful, but it is a very, very small population of analysts that can actually follow any of this. At the end of the day, we got to think to ourselves, so what? That's part of the title of my presentation. And when it comes to intelligence, so what is the question that we need to be asking ourselves continuously to answer, why am I reporting this? Who am I reporting it to? And what value will they get out of what I'm reporting? And if you can't answer the question of so what, then it's quite possible that whatever you're reporting is going to be relatively useless. And so the biggest problem with malware analysis today is that the general public, who should be ingesting a lot of what we're sending out, really can't understand any of this. The purpose of external reporting is to inform a wide audience about certain threats so that defenses can be implemented for a more proactive protection. At the end of the day, the way I think about malware and the technical components of cyber attacks is, they're quite frankly secondary concerns. If I am analyzing malware, that means I'm already looking at the second, third, fourth stage of an attack, and everything else that came before it has already happened. There are some more pressing issues when it comes to understanding cyber threats that I think are a little bit more important. One is preventing the delivery to begin with. What actually happens before malware is executed? How is it being delivered? What's the infection vector? And usually that infection vector, in most cases, is going to be non-technical. And most of the time, that's going to be delivered through social engineering, through phishing or something like that. And then another sort of primary concern about cyber attacks when it comes to malware is what's the potential impact of a certain attack? What happens after that malware has been executed? And this is something that executives and stakeholders really want to know. Like, if I am infected with malware, if my network or some computers are infected with malware, what's actually going to happen? How is it going to impact the organization and my business? What is the financial impact? What types of data loss and exfiltration might happen? What's my potential corporate exposure to these types of attacks and things like that? And as we go through this, we'll see some additional examples of the questions we should be asking ourselves when we're doing more technical analysis that will allow us to answer these types of questions and not just focus on technical artifacts. So for everyone who's listening, right now, I want you to think about a bank robbery in progress. Think about what that looks like. Visualize a bank robbery that is happening. It might look something like this. It might, a guy comes into a bank, is going to rob the bank. He's obviously holding a gun. He has a hoodie and a glove, some sort of facial masking. I don't know if this is a trash bag or what, but he's got something going on that's hiding his face. And, this is, one of, a ton of different possible examples you might be thinking of when it comes to a bank robbery in progress. Now, to associate that with what we do a lot of times with more technical analysis and malware analysis, what we're doing is we're taking this attack, which is this robbery, and we are hyper-focused on the weapon. We're hyper-focused on the malware. We want to know everything about that malware, in as detailed and as granular as we can possibly get. And when it comes to malware analysis, many times this is what we do, and we've completely ignored everything else that's going on in this scenario, in this attack. And so when we look at this, and we look at this example of a bank robbery, and we think about the investigators that are going to be looking at these attacks, do they really care about the intricate details of the weapon that's being used in the bank robbery? No, they absolutely do not. Do they care if a weapon was used, or maybe even what type of weapon was used? Yeah, they probably do, but they don't need to go into the granular details of that weapon in order to proceed their investigation. Some of the things that investigators really want to know are things like who robbed the bank, what was the bank robber wearing, when was the bank robbed, why did the robber choose this bank, what defenses, if any, did the robber have to overcome in order to make this robbery happen, how was the robber behaving during this robbery, and have there been any similar robberies in the area? And then also how much money was actually stolen as a result of this robbery. And when it comes to these questions, they're all linked to various basic, things that we're looking for when we're doing intelligence analysis, whether it's attribution, a general description of the threat, temporal indicators around the attack, motivation and behavioral characteristics, preparation of the attacker before the attack, the overall sophistication of the attacker, whether we can link this attack to any other attacks, and then the overall impact, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. These are the things that we really want to know, and this helps us better understand the bigger picture when it comes to threat intelligence. So I've mentioned threat intelligence a lot, but let's go into detail. What is threat intelligence? Because it's one of those terms that is misused all the time in our industry when we're talking about cyber attacks and the analysis of those attacks. So when it comes to what threat intelligence is, these are the general principles to think about when it comes to threat intelligence. It helps you understand the bigger picture. I'm not just focused on a singular thing or a singular tool or singular behavior, but I want to better understand how that thing associates to the overall threat landscape. It's enriched with additional context. So one of the things when you talk about intelligence, you're also hand in hand generally going to be talking about analysis. Intelligence is data that has been analyzed. And with that analysis comes the fact that we are providing some additional context to answer that question of so what for our audience. It's actionable and it's timely. So that means that when I'm looking at intelligence, if it's just, again, going back to that so what question, there has to be a reason that I can take this intelligence and apply it to what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. And it's not just something that just sits there and I can't really ingest or do anything with it. And it also has to be timely. If it is something, and when we get into something like IOCs and threat data, then we really start talking about the timeliness of quote unquote intelligence and data, and the fact that many times when we're talking about intelligence and people disseminate quote unquote intelligence, they're providing data that is essentially stale by the time it gets to the recipient. And it makes that data, quite frankly, useless. And then it also allows us to enhance our proactive defenses. With threat intelligence, it goes back to understanding the bigger picture. It allows us to more proactively, look for attacks, identify attacks, prevent attacks more proactively, instead of just receiving information, plugging into something like a SIM, and then detecting attacks that are already coming in or have already come in. So let's talk about threat data versus the two primary types of intelligence, which is tactical intelligence and strategic intelligence. So I mentioned threat data on the previous slide, and usually when you see a threat intelligence feed, it is generally going to be something like a threat data feed that consists of IOCs and other, very basic data, things like URLs or IP addresses, things like that. And when you look at threat data like that, it has a very short lifespan, meaning that by the time it has been inserted into that feed and has been received by a specific audience, the overall usefulness of that data has likely already passed. And if you think about that, the reason for that is a lot of data that comes into those feeds has been identified and collected in attacks that have been confirmed as attacks that have already happened. And so there is no proactive detection there. It is simply regurgitating the data that has been collected from known attacks. Now, also primarily threat data feeds are going to be consumed by applications rather than by actual individuals or analysts. They're going to be ingested directly into a SIM or a SOAR to easily look for specific pieces of that data. It also helps us associate specific individual attacks and not campaigns as a whole. And as I mentioned, it helps improve retroactive detection, so attacks that have already happened, but it doesn't really help us, without any additional analysis or intelligence, actually improve any proactive detection down the line. Compare that to things like tactical intelligence and strategic intelligence. Now, these are the two primary types of intelligence that you might see on a regular basis, and they're very different and consumed by different analysts for different reasons. So tactical intelligence is more specific and relates to TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures around a threat group or a threat campaign that extends to more than just a single attack, but will extend to signatures or characteristics across a group or campaign's multiple attacks. Now, this is going to be intelligence that's generally going to be consumed by practitioners, by the actual analysts that are trying to defend their environments. And this is what really helps us improve proactive detection. If I can't identify general characteristics that are used by the threat actors, then I can start writing new rules like YAR rules that can identify attacks before they've been identified anywhere else. And so I'm not just relying on specific threat data. Now I'm sort of looking at the bigger picture there. And then you have strategic intelligence. And this is really big picture stuff when we start talking about strategic intelligence, because this is more global in nature. This is looking at trends within the cyber threat landscape to understand what's actually going on, to understand an overall risk level, not just to my organization, but maybe to my industry as a whole, and for global attacks. And this is going to be intelligence that is initially going to be created by an analyst, but really is going to be the audience for strategic intelligence is generally going to be for decision makers, executives, and stakeholders that are going to be actually implementing and driving policy that will help secure my environment moving forward at a much higher level. So that's an overview of what intelligence is, what threat intelligence is. So let's talk about malware analysis versus intelligence analysis, what the difference is between the two, and how we can sort of merge the two of them together into something that will actually help a much broader audience. So when it comes to malware analysis and intelligence analysis, this is essentially an interesting battle that's been going on for quite some time as to which one is helpful for which audiences. And really, when you look at malware analysis and intelligence analysis, it really all comes down to training. Malware analysts, reverse engineers, their training, what they're trained to do is to hone on a specific, a specific piece of malware, a specific file, and dig deep into that file and learn everything we can about it. It is hyper-focused on the thing and understanding more about that thing. Whereas intelligence analysts are trained to look at that bigger picture, to understand how different pieces fit together, and to use that intelligence to understand different trends and what's going on in the threat landscape. So what we need to do moving forward is figure out a way to really turn malware analysis into malware intelligence analysis. And this will actually help us reach that broader audience and make a lot of our more technically sophisticated reporting more ingestible by a lot more people. And we can do that. There are essentially 4 specific components to malware intelligence analysis, and the various questions we should be asking ourselves as we're doing our analysis of certain malware, when we're writing up our findings and things like that. And this is in no way, shape, or form sort of conclusive of all the questions that we should be asking ourselves. They're simply a sampling of some of those questions, just to get you thinking about it. So when we're talking about preparation, when I'm trying to communicate from a malware perspective, how an audience, how the people who are reading my analysis should be using this information to prepare against future attacks. Essentially, what I'm trying to communicate is, what do I need to know in order to protect my users against a threat, whether my audience is internal or external. What is the initial infection vector? Are there specific vulnerabilities that are needed to be patched to protect against this specific threat? Who is the likely target of this threat? What is my overall risk level for this threat? And should I prioritize certain threats over others? So when we're talking about preparation, these are some of the questions that we should be talking about. Now, then we move from preparation to detection. So, outside of just preparing for an attack, because obviously we can't prepare for every single attack. Now we want to get into, how can we better detect any attacks that have sort of bypassed our initial defenses? And so this is, the questions that we're asking here are, what do I need to know to proactively detect a potential attack? And that proactive component is extremely important here. Things like, what types of suspicious behaviors should I be blocking or alerting on? What are some primary characteristics or TTPs of a specific type of threat? What high-value systems or applications is a threat likely to exploit? And then once we get to the next part is responding. So now we're talking about, if a threat has gotten through my defenses and I wasn't able to detect it, and something has happened, how am I best? What do I need to know to more quickly remediate a successful attack? I want to know, what threat is this? What actually owned me at the end of the day? How do I contain a specific threat and fully mitigate that threat? What artifacts should I be looking out for? What evidence can be collected in order to be used in a specific investigation? And you might notice this is where some of those more granular characteristics of malware can really come into play, because a lot of what we're reporting in malware analysis are things like, what types of artifacts will malware leave on a system that we can collect and identify that will connect us back to that malware. And then the final stage here is, once all this has been done, it's all about reporting. So if we're talking about if an attack has gotten through our defenses, wasn't detected, we responded to it, we still need to report back up to our stakeholders to let them know more about this attack. And that includes things like, what was the overall business impact? Do we know anything about the actors behind this attack? Is this activity similar to anything else that we're seeing out there, or what others are seeing? And then, is there any actionable intelligence that I can take from this incident and provide it to other people so they can, better prepare, detect, and respond to their attacks? And so these are just some of the questions when we're talking about intelligence analysis, when you're doing your technical analysis, to think about as you're going through your reporting cycle. And this is very much a cycle. When you talk about intelligence, you'll many times hear about the intelligence cycle. And this all goes back and forth over and over and over again. It's not just one singular thing. It's all about essentially going through the cycle. And once it's been reported, take what you've reported and take what you've learned to enhance your preparation, detection, and response going forward, and taking what other people have reported and doing the same thing there. It's very much a cycle. And so we've talked a little bit about sort of, malware analysis as an industry, how we've treated malware analysis, how we can improve it using some more strategic intelligence tactics, and then also, talking more about what threat intelligence is as a whole. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and wrap up my presentation with, how we can use some unique intelligence collection methods to better understand the full cycle of social engineering attacks like BEC. And so, just to level set, when we talk about what business email compromise is, BEC is very much one of those terms that has been used by many different vendors with many different definitions. It's very much turned into like today's APT. That means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. When I talk about BEC, essentially what I'm talking about is a spear phishing attack that involves the impersonation of a trusted individual or entity that tricks an employee into making a financial transaction or sending sensitive materials and persuading them to do that. And that can be done, generally speaking, by one of two high-level methods. One is by spoofing, and that can either be by spoofing the display name of the individual that's being impersonated, or by directly spoofing the email address as a whole. And then there's also the compromise side of things. Things like vendor email compromise have become extremely common today, and what are the most damaging subgroup of BEC attacks today. And that's where an email account has actually been compromised, and intelligence from that email account has been used to target other generally going to be customers of a vendor or a supplier. And when we think about why BEC has become such a problem over the past really 5 or 6 years, there are three primary reasons for this. One is traditional defenses have primarily focused on more technically sophisticated threats. Email defenses that have been around for multiple decades at this point. They came about looking for malware. Their whole drive was to defend against malware, and cyber criminals have figured this out. And they've shifted their tactics to become much more lo-fi, where they are not using malicious links or malicious payloads and just using pure social engineering to commit their attacks. Things like Bazakal is a great example of this, where you had a threat group that was primarily delivering malware through emails, and now is taking the time to have no payloads, no attachments in their email campaigns, and they're trying to get employees to call a call center to then get them to download malware completely separately from the initial communication. Also, BEC has a much higher return on investment, or ROI, than other types of cyber attacks. And if you think about this from a business perspective, because this is a really good way to think about cyber attacks, because for the most part, most cyber threat actors are going to be financially motivated. So it's all about the money. And what they're trying to do is maximize their return, maximize their profits. And so when you think about what's required in order to send out a BEC campaign, there's very little overhead that's required to do it. Essentially, you're identifying targets, and you're sending out emails. That's essentially what you're doing. And, one of the things that I've been thinking for a while, we started to see this coming to fruition really, over the past couple of years was, at some point, the Eastern European and the Russian cyber criminals are going to start thinking to themselves, why am I spending all of this time and money, hiring developers for my malware, setting up infrastructure, when I could just send people email, tell them to send me money, and they'll do it. We've started to see some more sophisticated actors in those regions in places like Eastern Europe, Russia, and even Israel start to enter the BEC space, likely because they've realized that the overall work that's required in order to make essentially a very similar amount of money is much less. And so that's another reason why we're seeing BEC attacks become such a problem. And the final reason that BEC has become an issue over the past 5 or 6 years is really social engineering at its core is extremely effective. As long as human beings have been on this earth, we've been socially engineering each other. The only difference is now we're doing it over email instead of doing it face-to-face or over the phone or through the mail. The same principles that have been used to con people for literally thousands of years are the same principles that are used today because it is very effective, and it's very difficult from a human behavior perspective to turn off some of those, ingrained reactions and reflexes, things like trusting what you see in front of you. It's very difficult to turn those off because as human beings, we're led to, our initial instinct is to look at something and trust it unless there's something else that will cause us to go against that. So at its core, social engineering is extremely effective. And so, we talk about BEC. The two primary cyber threats today that most people think about are BEC and ransomware. And I created this table to really compare and contrast the two because, quite frankly, they're on completely separate ends of the cyber threat spectrum. Both of these attacks are primarily financially motivated. BEC is almost exclusively financially motivated. Ransomware, the same thing, with the exception of a very few attacks. WannaCry and NotPetya that we saw a couple years ago are great examples of those. But for the most part, a vast majority of the ransomware attacks we see today are financially driven. But other than those similarities, everything else is very, very different. BEC is almost exclusively delivered through email. And ransomware today, while the initial infection vector used to be email, now that has almost completely changed. Now there are a variety of different attack vectors for ransomware. While email is an indirect vector of attack, and what I mean by that is usually ransomware is not directly delivered through email today. It's going to be delivered indirectly, so there's going to be a compromise through other types of malware. TrickBot's a big one that we're seeing these days, where there's an initial infection of a computer or a network, and that initial access is then exploited later on down the line to deploy malware. But then we also have things like other web applications, insecure web applications, password reuse on applications like RDP and VPNs. That's what we saw earlier this year with Colonial Pipeline and JBS. So ransomware has really shifted away from email becoming a primary attack vector and to a sort of a wide variety of other types of vectors. BEC, as we talked about on the previous slide, frequently bypasses legacy email defenses, where ransomware today is usually going to be detected by a lot of those email defenses. Again, because that is essentially what email defenses, most of those legacy defenses, have been trained to do. Ransomware gets all of the attention. When you think about what the media is reporting on from a cyber threat perspective, it gets a lot of the attention because primarily it's highly visible. Because ransomware, because of what it does, if it is deployed on a centralized network, like we just saw this past weekend with Sinclair, it's going to have an actual noticeable impact across the board. And it's not invisible. Whereas BEC is usually not going to be public. Because of the nature of BEC attacks, those are generally not going to come out and no one's going to realize that they've actually happened unless it's going to be something like a state or local government that has a requirement to report them, or if it's part of a legal document, and in that case, it might get out there. Another difference between BEC and ransomware attacks are, it's interesting when you talk about BEC, they are very highly decentralized actors that are coming from places like West Africa mainly Nigeria. And what I mean by decentralized is there are literally thousands of these actors out there, and there's a very loose organizational structure that connects all of these actors. It's not something like a very strict hierarchy like what we see with a lot of Eastern European and Russian cybercriminal organizations, where that is more centralized, where there is a sort of a strict hierarchy. And especially with things like ransomware as a service, you have a relatively small population of actors that influence a vast majority of the overall ransomware threat landscape, which means that if some of those actors are taken out of play, REvil is a great example of literally just happened, then you can actually make a noticeable impact in that threat landscape. Whereas you have something with BEC where you could arrest hundreds, if not thousands, of these actors, and you would make a very, very, very small dent in the overall threat landscape because they're decentralized. And then you look at like the threats that are posed by each one of these. Again, ransomware is the one that gets all the attention. But when you look at the FBI's IC3 report that came out earlier this year, it showed that last year 19,000 BEC attacks were reported compared to 2,000 ransomware attacks. And then the amount of financial loss is $1.9 billion for BEC compared to $29 million for ransomware. And, people will always say that there's underreporting involved and that, with ransomware, incident response is not included in that $29 million. And I'd say that it's the same thing goes with BEC. There's remediation involved there, and that cost isn't calculated in that $1.9 billion. And they're also very underreported. And so that 19,000 number is also quite low. And while ransomware obviously is a threat to businesses, I think when it comes to overall what enterprises, should be concerned about, everyday enterprises all around the world, I don't think it's a question that BEC takes the cake and dwarfs ransomware in the overall threat that it poses to most organizations out there. And that's sort of what my team does at Abnormal is we want to better understand BEC threats, to understand not just the threats themselves, but the full cycle of these attacks. What happens after these attacks are successful. And so, one of the interesting aspects of BEC that we don't see with other types of cyber attacks is that in order for it to be successful, it requires interaction with a victim. There actually has to be communication between a target and the attacker in order for the attacks to be successful, because the attacker has to respond and say, I want you to make a payment to this supposed vendor, and so on and so on. And so that communication has to take place. And this is really where, when we talk about unique intelligence collection methods, this is where we can sort of collect sort of some unique intelligence using some interesting tactics. And I think one of the things to think about is when it comes to intelligence collection, it doesn't always need to be passive. We don't always need to be simply taking what we're seeing within our environment, that's hitting our environment, that we're stopping there. Right? We can go beyond that and start collecting some additional intelligence that helps us better understand the threat as a whole, and not just essentially taking what the attackers are giving us. And so this is what we call active defense. And the definition that I use for active defense is interacting with an attack or an attacker for the purposes of collecting intelligence that helps us better understand the full scope of an attack. That could include things, which we'll see here on the next few slides, like engaging with BEC actors, seeding phishing sites, embedding beacons in those communications that gives us some rough geolocation information on the actors, or things like setting up honeypots. So when we talk about response-based attacks, I want to run you through a very brief example of how some of this intelligence collection could go. So let's say we have a BEC actor that's going to be impersonating one of our CEO or another executive, and they simply send an email saying, "I need your help with something. Are you available?" Now, if we're doing passive collection, this is all we have. We don't have anything else to go on. We don't know anything about the motivation. We don't know what they're looking for. We don't know what tactics they're going to be using. We don't know anything else about this actor. This is really all we have. And so when it comes to response-based attacks, one of the things that we can do, and this is one of the things that my team does every single day, is we've actually built a population of personas that we use to engage with these BEC actors that helps us understand the full cycle of these attacks. And with that, we can use one of these personas and say something like, "Oh yeah, Mr. CEO, happy to help. What did you need?" To which they'll say, "We have a pending payment that needs to get sent out urgently. Could you kindly process that payment to the beneficiary, get back to me ASAP?" So now we know more about what the overall motivation is, what this actor is actually looking to do in this attack. To which we send them a response saying, "Oh, of course, not a problem. Just go ahead and send me the beneficiary account details and I'll take care of it." To which they send us a mule account that they want us to wire money to. And so this gives us a little bit more context and information. Now we know a fraudulent account that we can pass on to financial partners to get those flagged or shut down. But of course, we're not going to actually send them any money. So we may say something like, "I'm actually getting a message that says this account is unable to receive incoming transfers at this time. Could you check on that and see what's going on?" To which they say, "Oh, you know what? Let's just look into that. Sorry for the inconvenience. Maybe you could try this beneficiary account instead and kindly get back to me when the payment has been sent." So now we have another mule account. And this really goes round and round in circles, really until these engagements extinguish themselves. In some cases, what we do is we'll actually send them fake confirmation receipts to say, "Oh, look, this payment has gone through. Do you have any other payments that need to be made?" And many times they'll say, "Oh, yeah, we actually do have another vendor that needs to get paid. Here's another payment that needs to go out." And so, again, this helps us much better understand what happens after a potential BEC attack is successful, and we're not just relying on that initial message. Now, similarly, we can do something similar for credential phishing attacks. And this is something that my team has been working on for a while now, using a lot of the same concepts and principles to help us better understand what happens after an email account has been compromised. So in this, what we do is we build out a population of personas and infrastructure of personas that are hosted on Microsoft Office 365 that we actually use to seed into enterprise-focused phishing attacks, things that are impersonating Dropbox, DocuSign, Microsoft Office, Adobe, things like that. And what we're able to do is once we seed those credentials into those phishing sites, we're then able to monitor those accounts to see what happens after they've been compromised. And we can better understand things like, how quickly are accounts accessed? Where are they being accessed from? How is the account being accessed? And then also, how is the actor using the account? Are they pivoting to other applications? What are they trying to go after once they've gotten access to these accounts? Are they going to use it to collect intelligence? Are they going to set up forwarding and redirect rules? Are they going to use it to start spamming out a whole bunch of other phishing emails to other users? It gives us a better understanding of an attacker's behavior within these accounts. And so with that, that's all I've got for you today. I really appreciate everyone being here. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I love giving talks at B-Sides because of the audience that usually comes to these. If anyone has any questions, I have my contact information is on the screen here. Feel free to email me, hit me up on Twitter, and I'd be happy to chat. With that, I'm going to close this. As we're waiting for any potential questions, I will say, one of the interesting Adam's got a good question. I'll answer here in a sec. From a law enforcement perspective, I mentioned this a little bit earlier about how effective law enforcement is in combating cyber threats. And this is a question I get a lot. And I think it really depends on the type of threat. When it comes to, as I was talking about the differences between ransomware and BEC, it really comes down to the centralization of certain threats. When you look at ransomware today, when you have law enforcement operations like we recently saw, and you have a majority of ransomware attacks coming from a small number of groups, I think right now a little bit more than half of all ransomware activity we see today is either through Lockbit or Conti or even what was our evil. So when you take one of those groups out of play, that really, and then none of the affiliates can then actually use any of that malware at that point, then you've really impacted the threat landscape. again, going back to BEC, I think law enforcement is doing as good a job as they can, but it is very difficult to make an impact in the BEC threat landscape simply through law enforcement, because there's simply a volume game. There are so many actors that are not associated with one another, and just because you've arrested 10 of them doesn't mean that you have sort of trickled down to making an impact across the way. So Adam had a question about, why do email filters suck at identifying BEC, and what can we do about it? I mean, that's a great question. I mean, that's been the $10,000 question that we've been asking. I mean, that's why companies like Abnormal Security, that's why we exist initially, was to solve that problem, because most legacy email defenses have been more focused on sort of signature-based detection versus behavioral or content-based detection. And when you have actors that are essentially only using text to try to persuade an employee to actually try and manipulate them to do something, then all of that signature-based detection is really worthless because of how it works. And so I agree with some of the things that some of the things that have been put in the chat, things like regex, and this also goes back to tactical intelligence as a whole, and looking at the behaviors of these attacks. Because when you start looking at BEC attacks at a larger scale, you definitely start seeing some patterns in how they write and how they operate. A lot of these groups are using templates, things that they call formats, which are essentially scripts that they use for the initial and next 2 or 3 messages that go back and forth to an employee. And so if you understand those patterns, then you can start writing some better rules that will be able to detect those en masse more proactively. And yeah, there are certainly services out there like Abnormal that are built for specifically detecting social engineering attacks. And again, I'd be happy to chat with anyone who's interested in those. Another question from Adam: are you seeing BEC starting to transition into unfiltered communication mechanisms such as SMS, or the attackers still sticking to email? So right now, the only examples that I have seen of BEC actors pivoting to SMS has been almost exclusively actors that are requesting gift cards. A lot of BEC actors today, when they're trying to get an employee to go out and buy gift cards for them, which still illogically is about 50% of all BEC attacks are requesting gift cards. A lot of those either come directly to SMS or try to immediately pivot to SMS right after the initial email. The reason for that is because then the employee can simply go directly to a store, buy the gift cards, take pictures of them with their phone, and send them directly to the scammer. So there's an efficiency angle to it. But outside of that, I haven't seen any widespread examples of like wire transfer BEC attacks, vendor email compromise attacks, or payroll diversion, pivoting to any other mechanisms. That being said, I have no doubt that as our cloud environments evolve and grow, I think that it's definitely going to be inevitable that other communication platforms, things like Slack or Teams, will eventually be the target of cyber criminals and social engineering attacks that we don't see at a large volume today. So Sarah asked a question of, I heard there are now ransomware kits to help people get started, and the distributor simply asks for a cut of the profits. Can you speak towards this? Yeah, so that's essentially what's called ransomware as a service today, where you have the primary actors that have created the malware. They may even provide access to a portal or a dashboard that will allow affiliates to track their campaigns as they go out. Usually when that happens, each affiliate gets their own key. And so that's essentially how the primary actors are differentiating one affiliate from another affiliate. And that also means that, that also means that an affiliate only has a certain amount of time to be able to use that ransomware. And usually they're getting, you're absolutely right, either a cut of the ransom or an upfront cost that they're going to be sharing with the primary actors. But essentially what ransomware as a service does is it lowers the overall the barrier to entry for a lot of these less sophisticated actors to get into the ransomware space. But at the end of the day, you still have those primary actors that if the primary actors weren't there, then the affiliates wouldn't be able to do what they do. And Marcy, we still have 5 minutes. Is that right?
We do. The room will stay open as long as there are still people in it.
Okay.
So if you would like to continue taking Q&A, you're more than welcome to.
Perfect. So another question from Sarah. I've noticed a lot of BEC formats are eFax, fax message. What are the threat actors using this practically outdated technology as a format? That is a fantastic question, Sarah, and it's a question that me and my team ask all the time. A lot of those credential phishing messages that get out there are, you're absolutely right, eFaxes, or you have a voicemail that's waiting for you. I don't exactly know why they're still using that. I can tell you, the logic behind it is very similar to what I think about when it comes to gift card BEC attacks. From a logical perspective, it's really difficult to think, man, these guys must be making a ton of money on gift card BEC attacks. Their success rate can't be that big. Why do we still see this happening? And we're going on now 2 years of gift cards being the primary thing requested in BEC attacks. But what I can say is, because these attacks are financially motivated, the ROI for the attacks must still be there, or else they would have pivoted to some other tactics. And so it must be the same thing with these eFax and voicemail messages, that the success rate for them must still be there in order for the return to be good enough for them, or else they would have, tried some other, other types of lures. But that's sort of, that the why behind things like that is really difficult to answer, but it's a really good question. And then let's see. So Adam has another question. Ransomware as a service took us by surprise. Might BEC as a service become a reality? We've got R evil. Why not BEC evil? I do think that we are coming up on that. You do see in a very few underground forums, there are something similar when it comes to the initial compromise of mailboxes, whether it's going to be either selling access to mailboxes that are going to be taken over and used for vendor email compromise attacks, or something similar to where an actor might run the initial credential phishing campaign and provide an affiliate with the compromised mailboxes that are captured from that campaign. I do think, one of the things that I think is inevitable at some point, especially because of the hyper focus on ransomware, especially with the US government, is that, one of the biggest drivers of ransomware today is cryptocurrency. If it weren't for cryptocurrency, the scale of ransomware attacks would not be possible. Even if they were being requested in things like wire transfers, because of the regulation that's involved and the visibility that's involved in those transactions, which you don't have with cryptocurrency. You wouldn't be able to have something like a $40 million ransom being requested and paid in anything else other than cryptocurrency. Because of that, I think that it is inevitable that we're going to see some regulations and crackdowns coming down on cryptocurrency, which I think, in the next 2-3 years will likely make cryptocurrency not, as attractive as a payment method for ransomware actors, which will essentially have a massive impact in that landscape. But the question is, what will happen to those actors that are running ransomware campaigns today? They're not just going to go away, because it's all financially motivated. And so they're going to have to pivot somewhere. And in my opinion, I think we're going to start seeing a lot of these more sophisticated actors coming out of Eastern Europe and Russia starting to pivot to things like BEC, because they've sort of observed and they've seen the success that other actors are having in that space. And because they're really accustomed to things like as a service things they run in underground forums, I think it's very possible that those will be the primary actors that are going to be involved in those sort of like a BEC as a service in the future. Cool, Marcy. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. Anyone else still around? Thanks again for attending the session. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to chat.